Hi everyone, welcome back to POT 4936, Democracy and Propaganda. I'm your instructor Barbara Howe, and I'm making this video to help students with the difficult article from 2022. It's by a guy by the name of Martin Breul, and it's called Lies, Bullshit, or Propaganda with a question mark. So that tells you right away that, the question mark is kind of getting at the question that the article is trying to answer, which is that this author is going to try to distinguish between these three concepts: lies, bullshit, and propaganda. He says there's important conceptual differences between these three things. So what I'm going to do, well, first of all, I want to say also that yes, it's true. This is a little difficult article. This is an academic article published in an academic journal. It's not long, but it is dense. But we have been preparing for it. So there are three people that you want to be thinking about when you're reading this article. The first person is, of course, Hannah Arendt, who we just read last week. So keep her in mind, keep some of the concepts that she mentioned in mind, and that will help. The second person is, of course, Plato. That one's maybe more in the background. I'll tell you about it when we get there, but there is definitely some echoes of Plato here. And then the third person is Jason Stanley, who this author does explicitly reference when it comes to defining the concept of propaganda. So, of course, recalling Hannah Arendt, Plato, and Jason Stanley will all help you in understanding this relatively difficult article. So what I'm going to do in this video is first I'm going to go over the introduction, which is really important because it provides kind of a roadmap to the argument, and it will help keep you from getting lost in the rest of the argument. So don't skip over the introduction. Read it carefully. He's going to tell you exactly what he's going to do in the rest of the article. Section 2, I think, is the easiest section. That's the one where he distinguishes those concepts, lies, bullshit, and propaganda. I think you can pretty much handle that one on your own. I'm going to focus in this video on helping you out with the third section, which is Breul's critique of the term post-factual. Okay? So on the next slide, we will start with the introduction, a roadmap to the argument. Okay, so you've noticed that in the introduction, the author says that first he's going to analyze whether what is commonly subsumed under the label of post-factuality is lies, bullshit, or propaganda. In other words, this author is going to make a conceptual distinction amongst those three concepts. This is what he calls a conceptual analytical perspective, or it's an analysis of concepts, okay? Then he says that there are two kinds of ways to understand post-factual. Once we've figured out whether it's lies, bullshit, or propaganda, there's two ways to understand it, either a steady or an unsteady reading. So here it's important to remember that by the word reading, in this context, the author means an interpretation or an understanding of something. So a steady reading or a steady understanding of post-factual is one that uses our existing theoretical framework, in that the idea that we have democratic discourse that normally exists, but for some reason lately it's broken down. That's the steady understanding, meaning like it's taking our existing assumptions, our existing ideas about how the world works or how democratic discourse works, and thinks that something is just broken about it. Now, the disruptive reading, or the disruptive reading or the disruptive understanding of post-factual is a questioning of that democratic discourse itself. The idea that it's the idea that there is no democratic discourse, there is no truth, there is no common basis for reality, everything is political. So that's the disruptive reading. So one of the things I wanted to point out to you in this first section, the introduction, is you see the sentence that says, in a second step, I will go beyond this conceptual analytical perspective and will offer a normative deconstruction of the term post-factual. So that's just a good sentence I wanted to draw your attention to, because this is a skill you can use in reading other difficult articles that you may encounter in your academic career. Here, the author has told you, he's just identified what that previous thing is that he's talked about, and that was where he's going to make a conceptual distinction between lies, bullshit, and propaganda. He's calling that a conceptual analytical perspective. So that's just another way to think about what that is. It just reminds you that what he's doing there is analyzing concepts. And the rest of the sentence goes, and I will not offer a normative deconstruction of the term post-factual. So it's just the author's way of describing in different words what it is that they're doing, but that can be very helpful to you in understanding that these are two parts of the author's argument. Okay, so recall what that word normative means. It's meaning that you're making a value judgment that something is good or bad. A normative stance means taking a stance on something, not being neutral. And then deconstruction means like an unbuilding of a social fact in order to see what makes up that social fact. So when he says it's a normative deconstruction of the term post-factual, he just means he's going to make a value judgment about how that term post-factual is being used, basically. Okay, so section 2 is his conceptual analysis, or the distinction between those three different concepts, lies, bullshit, or propaganda. I feel like you can handle this part on your own. I'm going to tell you more about the third part. The only thing I wanted to say in regards to the second is at some point there, I think they say a constitutive significance. And I just wanted to point out that word constitutive means something, what makes a thing up, what constitutes a thing is the things that make up that thing. So like a pencil is constituted of wood plus lead plus a bit of rubber on the end for the eraser, right? That's what it means to constitute something. So I think he uses the term there and to talk about propaganda having a constitutive significance. This is on page 6 of the PDF, page 57 of the article. That's really important. You're going to need to understand that pretty well. What it means is that propaganda constructs its own social reality. And that is what he's contrasting to the concept of lying, which a liar takes the existing, commonly accepted basis of reality of what is true and false and tells a falsehood. So they're existing within the same concept of truth and reality, and they're actually saying something that is untrue. That's what lying is. And then he also says bullshit is the idea that you also exist within that common basis, so that there is an idea of what is truth, but you just don't care. So he's distinguishing those two, lying and bullshit, from propaganda, because lying and bullshit both are premised upon this idea that there is such a thing as truth. It's just that the bullshitter just doesn't care what the truth is. The liar is actually saying an untruth. The bullshitter doesn't care. But a propagandist, this is where you're going to need to use Jason Stanley's concept of false ideology. A propagandist has all of reality upside down, So there is no more common basis for understanding. There is no truth. Truth is what the propagandist says it is, okay? So read the second part, I think, pretty carefully. The next slide, I'm going to talk you through parts of the third section of the article, which is Breul's critique of the term post-factual. Okay, so what is Breul's critique of the term post-factual? What's the danger that he says comes out of using this term post-truth politics? This quote on the slide here I've taken from the introduction, and I think it's a good summary. Remember, he's going to make this argument more completely in section 3, but here's his short summary of what his critique is. He says the real danger of post-truth politics does not consist in an attempt to overcome the age of facts, that we have never lived in this age, and it's a misconstrual to believe that we once managed to base politics on objective facts alone and just recently stopped being able to do that. The real danger of post-truth politics comes from the incorrect conclusion that comes from the correct assumption that there can be no knowledge of neutral facts. In other words, he is saying that the assumption that there can be no knowledge of neutral facts, that is correct, but the conclusion is incorrect. The conclusion being that therefore we cannot have any regulative ideals of truth, accuracy, and objectivity to form a basis for a democratic society, that conclusion is incorrect. Okay, so it's a little bit complicated, but he says that it's a correct assumption to say that facts are never interpreted in a neutral manner. There's always some bias in the interpretation of facts. I'll tell you more about what he means in the next slide, but recall here Hannah Arendt. It sounds a little bit like he's disagreeing with Hannah Arendt, but he is not. Hannah Arendt says that facts exist outside of the political realm, right? But recall that one sentence towards the end, I think it's in the section 4 or 5 towards the end, where she says that the facts remain outside of politics. So in other words, it's always going to remain true that in 1914, Germany invaded Belgium and not the other way around. But once those facts get interpreted through a narrative, that's where they enter the political realm. So I think Breul is going off of an understanding of facts that is very similar to Hannah Arendt, and he's saying that not facts themselves, but facts as they are interpreted, those are never neutral. The facts still exist, but the interpretation of what those facts mean, that's never a neutral endeavor, okay? So given that that's a correct assumption, that is true, what is incorrect is to believe that therefore there can be no common basis of truth, objectivity, or accuracy as a common epistemic foundation for democracy, okay? So that's an incorrect conclusion to draw from the correct assumption, the understanding that the interpretation of facts is never neutral, okay? So I'll tell you one last thing on the next slide. Okay, so Breul's critique of the term post-factual is that it implies that there was once an era in which we based political decisions on objective or neutral knowledge of what facts mean, and this is not so. He calls it a politically toxic neologism. Okay, and the reason why that is because he talks about the cognitive potential of democracy. So he says, in other words, what does he mean? This is about somewhere on page 60, right below, the beginning of part 3. Democracy does not just aggregate or add up subjective preferences of citizens. It is a deliberative process. It's a cooperative search for common solutions. And it's not a matter of numbers, he says at the bottom of page 60. So where he talks about it, even if you're in a majority, so it's not a matter of how many people agree that 2 + 2 = 5. The truth is not up for a majority vote. So does that sound familiar? It should sound familiar because that is exactly what a point that Plato made when he was talking with Gorgias, right? That it doesn't, actually when he was talking with Polus in the dialogue Gorgias, he says to Polus, it doesn't matter how many people agree with you. If it's illogical, it's still not going to make it right. So that's a similar point to what Breul is saying here. He's talking about the democratic deliberative process, and he says, I have to say this too that may help explain. That term, democratic deliberative process, is usually been used by theorists like Jürgen Habermas, who talked about it as a way of explaining political legitimacy. So, for example, a regime is legitimate, it has legitimacy in the eyes of people if it is based upon a decision-making process that is democratic, for example. So Breul says here, although that's the way the term has normally been used, we can also use that term to understand how this post-factuality term is working. So he says we can use it to deconstruct that term, post-factuality. So instead of a political norm is legitimate if it can be justified in such a way that it could be accepted with good reasons by everyone. So in other words, he says there always has to be an epistemic dimensions to the democratic deliberation process. Whenever it becomes apparent that one can only present reasons for one's own position, which from the point of view of the other side can or even must be regarded as the illegitimate generalization of particular values, then that is not enough of an epistemic basis for democratic deliberation. Okay, look at his example. He says at the bottom of page 61, says, as a case in point, it's quite telling that totalitarian propaganda never relies on itself alone, but it always is accompanied by the suppression of dissenters, attacks on the free press, for example. So in other words, like, remember how Socrates described logic is consistent with itself. It could just rely on itself alone. That doesn't work for propaganda. Propaganda has to have these external source. It has to repress external sources of dissent, because there are always going to be people who do not see the illogic or do not agree with the illogic of the propaganda. They're saying, wait a minute, no, up does not equal down, left does not equal right, things are, good or bad, that there is some kind of truth that is the opposite of what the propagandist, is saying. There's always going to be people like that, right? The propagandist has to suppress that dissent in order for what they're saying to be regarded as legitimate. Logic never has to do that. Logic or rationality never has to rely on suppressing dissent, because it justifies itself. It is self-confirmatory. Okay? So a little complicated there. This section is a little bit difficult. He says on page 62, we could distinguish between those who try to approach the standards of adequate justifications of political norms as best they can, and those who completely disregard such norms as irrelevant. Okay? And then the other thing I wanted to make out is that somewhere in this section, he uses this word retorsive. So what does that mean? He says the orientation towards the ideal of reciprocity is not usually substantiated normatively, but retorsively. So what does that mean? It just means like kind of payback of like kind. It's like a twisting of the law or of meaning that it's substantiated retorsively, meaning because of this, I'm going to give you the same thing. Okay? So it's a little bit strange. You could almost just ignore that word. It's just like, it's just a rhetorical trick. We'll call it that. It's not that important, but I did want to try to explain it a little bit here. So yeah, that roughly is Breul's critique of the post-factual. This section 3 is the most difficult. You probably need to read that more than once. Of course, like I always say, you always need to read political theory more than once. So it's a difficult article, but read it more than once. Also read it with your reading buddy in the class. Working together will help so much while we're reading these difficult things, okay? So we will talk about it in class on Wednesday. And I hope this video was helpful. I'll see y'all then. Bye.